One, two, three, four.
And so Brother Wacko and I, we became real tight. He considers me as his minister. I am a minister, and I do consider myself a brother minister because I'm a brother first. And so we had full spiritual relationship and exchange. He's telling me about one of the most witchcraft-laden places in the country, and the center of the ghetto within it. Magnolia projects, Calliope project. We've heard about it through record. Where he was telling me about it, and he was telling me that right there on the project grounds was the school, and I believe he said the church too. He said all your needs could be met right there on the grounds. And keep in mind, I was the one looking at everything with a suspicious eye. He did, of course, begin to see those things himself as we talked about it, and the Lord revealed it to us both in greater detail. The government project itself is a experiment in necromancy and causing possession. The goal is to cause possession of particular individuals who are from selected families and bloodlines, who must be approved to be able to receive one of these government housing facilities. Now, along with the information that I got from my brother Wack, I had the opportunity on the Humbug to hear a historian, a member of the Detroit Public School System, who's been a member for years. He was running down a history, and he was just talking about different historical things in the city, and he was talking about the Smith homes. And he explained that it had once been a military base. Now, people that live there have been saying for some time that they've been hearing through the grapevine it was built on top of a graveyard. Now, ironically, this was information I had come to months before I ever met Wack, and before he ever told me about that being the case with the Magnolia. So now we can do some deductive reasoning here. We can make some hypotheses, some theories. We can discern with our spirit that this is not isolated incidents. We're talking about New Orleans and Detroit. If all of this is true and above board, and that's why this is going to be a series within a series, because I want to bring you to the elder who is the source of much of the information about the history of this particular project here, and who does remember this, and who has said that it is true, that it was indeed built on a grave site. And so there's a lot of extras I want to bring in on this, because some of you live in the projects or know someone who lives in the projects, and if you've ever been to the projects, even people that come from hardcore hoods, say the projects is the worst of the worst. Why is the projects worse than the rest of the hood? It has to do with that energy, that negative dead energy, that negative energy, that gangster boogie spirit. Yes, the boogie is nothing but another word for spirit, and it was brought to my attention through a viewer, my brother Blanco. He let it be known that a gangster boogie is one too, and there is a gangster spirit, and if it's over anywhere, it's over Louisiana, and it's over Detroit, it's over Compton, it's over Chicago, it's over New York. We know this. It's over Atlanta. We know this. It's over Miami. But there are certain places where the projects are most notorious, and where the government assistance is a huge part of people's lives. And when that's so, you create a dependency. Now, we're going to leave socialism and all of its ills to another excerpt of the Occult Ghetto. I want the bottom line to be that you understand the spiritual implications of living on top of what used to be a grave site. You ever seen Poltergeist? Their whole problem in the original Poltergeist movie was caused because they lived on top of an old burial ground. This comes from a real understanding in the occult sciences. When you disturb or disrespect the burial chambers, think about what happened to those who went in and raided King Tut's tomb. When you disturb the burial chambers, there's you tear a fabric in the time-space continuum. You create negative energy in the ether that allows for negative entities to come out. And so you have these negative entities, by and large, possessing the people, the families, the chosen families, because it's chosen families that, by and large, have a lot of children. The original commandment, be fruitful and multiply. So you talk, oh, they have all these babies and blah, blah, blah. But now we're talking about a government who understands more about you than you do. A government that can read the souls of your footprint and understand things about your bloodline and your family line. A government that wants to keep a perpetual poverty going on among grandma and mama and daughter and then the daughter's daughter. And this is what you see in the projects, not just for poverty's sake, but because of the spiritual implications of doing so. It's a generational curse creator to live in the projects, on the project's grounds that has been cursed. I maintain that when it's not built, the old ones were probably all built on grave sites. Please, my brothers and sisters in New York, LA, Georgia, wherever this may find you, please help add on to this. This is not something I'm an expert at. This portion is something that the Most High has brought to me in recent years, and I've not still found enough evidence. The paper trail on this is hard to follow.
Today, the word ghetto is synonymous with poverty, racism, families under stress. All the above were true of here, the world's first ghetto.
And I was sitting in a hotel, and a voice said to me, he said, look around, what do you see? And I said, I see all colors of people doing everything, And the voice said, do you see any niggas? I said, no. And I said, you know why? Because there aren't any. And it hit me like a shot, man. I started crying and shit. I was sitting there, I said, yeah, I've been here 3 weeks. I haven't even said it. I haven't even thought it. And it made me say, oh my God, I've been wrong. I've been wrong. I got to regroup my shit. I said, I ain't gonna never call another black man a nigga. Because we never was no niggas. That's a word that's used to describe our own wretchedness. And we perpetuate it now because it's dead. That word's dead. We men and women, we come from the first people on the earth. The first people on the earth were black people. Because anthropologists, white anthropologists. So the white people go, that could be true, Yeah, Dr. Leakey and them found people remains 5 million years ago in Africa. Them motherfuckers didn't speak French. So black people, we the first people had thought. Right? We was the first one to say, where the fuck am I? And how do you get to Detroit?
All cities have this particular residential area. In Detroit, they call it Black Bottom. In Cleveland, they call it Euclid Avenue, 55th, 105th, Central Avenue. In Philadelphia, they call it South Street. In New York City, they call it Harlem. Drop down below the Cotton Curtain, in Atlanta, they call it Buttermilk Bottom. But then you come out west, where it's the best. In San Francisco, they call it the Fillmore District. In Los Angeles, they used to call it Watts. They changed the name, though. All cities have this particular residential area. I'm gonna leave, get a job with the help and the grace of a God. Save my money and get rich, I know, and bring it back to Tobacco Road. Bring that light and the crane, blow it up and start all over again. And I'll build a town I'll be proud to show, and keep the name Tobacco Road, 'cause it's a home, yeah.
Tobacco Road can be any black Negro ghetto in America. Whenever a brother leaves one city going to another, well, he's really just going from one ghetto to another in that particular city. He's going to the ghetto, and he knows this. That's where his people are.
Why you have to bring that ball? I ain't saying nothing if it get took.
Y'all want to see a dead body?
Yeah.
From kings of Kush to slaves of Kush. A child once asked, "Daddy, how did we end up in the ghetto?" Wow, what a thought. But any fully awakened, selfless, and conscious mind just has got to wonder, how did former kings and queens, the artisans of the arts, the caretakers of the culture, go from the pyramids to the projects, spanning over the decades, tracing their journey from the time of Pharaoh Ramesses in 1200 BC to the period of Reconstruction in the 1800s. So-called people of color, once a people of culture, have transitioned, and some will say devolved, from once mighty and godly people into the puppets of devils and sirens of Satan, singing songs of the destruction of morality in society. The ghettos of Italy. There are island ghettos, ghettos in the jungles of South and Central America, ghettos in Brazil. There were the ghettos in Warsaw, Jewish ghettos, Amish ghettos. And in spite all of these, it is the notorious black ghettos and government projects of the U.S. that have gradually, unnaturally, unseen-handedly transitioned the poverty mindset into a hermetic counterculture that has, for many, become a way of life, and the only culture that they know or recognize. The miseducated accept it, even embrace it as a lifestyle. The dysfunctional spirit of the disenfranchised, miseducated, and underserved have provided mainstream America, and now the world, with their pressure-inspired entertainment, and have provided the world with much memorable amusement, constantly crafting new creations inspired by their tormented souls. So, how did what was intended to be temporary housing become a haven for generational poverty, murder, and ancestral curses? How did this place that your ancestors did not choose to be in and only moved to because they were forced by a lack of choices become your home?
Have you forgotten that once we were brought here, we were robbed of our name, robbed of our language, we lost our religion, our culture, our God, and many of us, by the way we act, we even lost our mind.
The phenom of the ghetto and its notorious single-parent households was an old trick that evolved from out of the alleged psychological operations that gave us the women's liberation movement, the 1960s cultural changes and ideas, as well as the growing popularity of welfare programs. These programs would promise to give housing, food, clothing, even child benefits, as long as there is no male in the household. These new social attitudes and programs gave incentive and inspiration for young parents ambitiously chasing the illusion of the American dream to abandon the traditional family structure. The mass incarceration and increasing disenfranchisement of black men, combined with the new attitude of the heavily promoted independent woman, gave birth to the New World Order designed family structure we see today. One where the government controls the children by way of controlling the woman without fear of interference from the man. This tactic is basically Warfare 101 and aligns with the notion of, as a woman goes, so goes a nation. The concentration of African American families in impoverished urban areas, often referred to as ghettos, is a complex issue with deep historical, social, and economic roots. This phenomenon can be traced back to several key factors, and understanding them requires a nuanced exploration of historical injustices, economic disparities, and systemic racism. 1. Historical legacy of slavery and segregation. The legacy of slavery and segregation in the United States has had a profound impact on the spatial distribution of African American communities. For centuries, Black individuals were subjected to slavery, denied basic rights, and forcibly segregated into racially designated neighborhoods. The effects of these practices still linger in many American cities. 2. Redlining and housing discrimination. In the 20th century, discriminatory practices like redlining systematically denied African Americans access to housing in certain neighborhoods, particularly those with better resources and opportunities. Banks and lending institutions refused loans and mortgages to black families based solely on their race, effectively confining them to limited housing options. 3. Economic disparities. Economic disparities play a pivotal role in the prevalence of ghettos. African Americans have historically faced higher levels of unemployment, lower wages, and reduced access to quality education and employment opportunities. These economic challenges make it difficult for many black families to move out of impoverished neighborhoods. 4. Mass incarceration. The disproportionate incarceration of African Americans in the United States has also contributed to the ghettoization of communities. Upon release from prison, formerly incarcerated individuals often face restricted housing options and limited access to stable employment, pushing them back into impoverished neighborhoods. 5. Lack of investment. Many ghettos suffer from a lack of public and private investment, resulting in substandard infrastructure, schools, and services. This perpetuates a cycle of poverty that is challenging to break. 6. Systemic racism. Systemic racism, which manifests in various forms, including police violence and educational inequalities, further compounds the challenges faced by African American families in ghettos. These systemic barriers hinder opportunities for advancement and perpetuate the cycle of poverty. 7. Cultural and social factors. Social dynamics within communities also influence the concentration of African American families in ghettos. Factors like social networks and cultural ties can keep families in neighborhoods where they have established roots. With that, we can confidently conclude that the concentration of African American families in ghettos is a result of a long history of discrimination, economic disparities, and systemic racism. Addressing this issue requires a comprehensive approach that includes equitable access to housing, education, employment opportunities, criminal justice reform, and dismantling systemic racism. Realizing the cycle of ghettoization is a complex challenge, and it is essential for achieving a more just church and nation. And if we have learned anything from the last 50 years of hip-hop, rather than focus on nostalgia and celebrate all of the money that it has made, corporate America, and a select few artists as elder statesmen, let us use hindsight to avoid what seems to be the inevitable destruction and degradation of more communities by the ghetto ghost, and most urgently, we must prevent the moral and spiritual corruption of our daughters who are now in its crosshairs. For our sons, it may seem to be too late. The PTSD and arrested development caused by generations of living in the conditions of the ghetto has caused Generation X to act as the immature and oblivious parents of a problem child who are in denial about their child's obvious delinquency. And every physical or material thing has a spiritual root. Those who can only see half the world only see partial truth.
Little ghetto boy.
Tonight, New Orleans is a city in crisis. Police are looking for leads.
Extremely violent crime wave.
The teenage boy is now dead.
Shot and killed overnight.
Dubbed the murder capital of the country.
A new list ranks Cincinnati as the murder capital of America.
But here's the catch. Detroit still has the highest violent crime rate of any major U.S. city.
D.C. in the early 1990s came to be known as the murder capital of the country.
A special report from one of the United States' most violent cities, where, on average, there is a murder almost every other day. Many feel gang violence is out of control in St. Louis in Missouri, and children are among the innocents caught in the crossfire. Gunshot injuries are so common, in fact, that specialist hospitals have been set up to deal with them. And with military-grade weapons in the hands of teenagers, it's not hard to see why some police officers think the city's streets are more dangerous than Afghanistan.
Reverend Kenneth McCoy walks the streets of North St. Louis. He hands out food to the homeless in one of the most dangerous areas in the U.S.
And tonight there's a $100,000 reward for information in a wave of child killings.
A lot of people talking about their frustration over the level of gun violence, and that children once again were hit by gunfire.
16 young people under 19 years of age have been killed by gun violence in St. Louis this year. 14 were killed last year.
Walking home with friends in West Philadelphia after a pickup basketball game when a group of young people approached them and clashed.
How does it go from guys arguing to someone pulling a gun?
It's just the way the world is nowadays. It's like people feel like they gotta have a gun to, have power.
One bullet grazing his shoulder. It was a near miss. Rasan was lucky. Too often in Philadelphia, someone else's child is not.
A very dangerous night on South Street. 14 people were shot. 3 of those people have now died.
The city of brotherly love, bleeding in bullets.
You just hear it. They just start shooting.
In a nation where gun violence has become an epidemic from city to city, Philadelphia is setting its own grim record. 562 people shot dead last year, the most ever in its history.
Oh my God.
Hundreds more than New York or Los Angeles.
Someone must have got hit.
Whether your driver's license describes you as white or black, at this point in history, you can say that the ghetto has affected you and or your children, if in no other way than through the ghetto-born, supernatural phenomena of the counterculture called hip-hop and its star component, rap music. But as we reflect upon where we are today and how we got here, I feel compelled to ask the question, have we become the proverbial parent in denial, who defends and excuses their offspring's wrongdoing, no matter how bold and disrespectful? At this point, if we are elders, we cannot allow for even further degradation of our daughters by this so-called culture. At the rate it's going today, and through the rise of ratchet female rap, this culture will only continue to bring about more self-destructive behavior, inspired by the spirit of its music. Will we obliviously celebrate its birth, its commercial success, as well as its awards and achievements, while the spirit of rebellion has its way with our young women? Will we hey and ho in the same sorry way that we stood idly by and allowed it to turn out and brainwash our sons? As you note how the world seems to celebrate this so-called culture, consider the fact that what they are celebrating is a symptom of the ghetto, which was and still is a place designed by the enemy in order to produce multi-generational death, poverty, miseducation, and ignorance. Some may only see the things that the media and critics of this world highlight as positive products of the ghetto. But to have an honest dialogue about this netherworld that some of us know so well, we have to look over a few receipts, and together we'll discover how much we actually don't know about it.
Talking about the ghetto, funky, funky ghetto, trying to survive, trying to stay alive.
But perhaps the best example of how European ethnics would finally gain the full benefits of whiteness came with an innovation in housing at the end of World War II. It was a time when hundreds of thousands of GIs came home ready to start families, but had no place to live.
The living space was at a premium. When in the Bronx, they tried building Quonset huts, and they turned to slums. All the Quonset huts had just disintegrated. There were two families sharing a hut. One family at one end, one family at the other, and before you know it, they were awful.
FHA came to the rescue by insuring long-term, low monthly payment mortgage loans.
Veterans needed homes for families. They turned to a revolutionary New Deal housing program. It would racialize housing, wealth, and opportunity for decades in ways few could have imagined.
In the 1930s, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration, whose job it was to provide loans, or the backing for loans, to average Americans so they could purchase a home.
Due to the stimulation of the National Housing Act, from every section of the country come reports of vastly...
In order to purchase a house in America prior to 1930s, you had to pay 50% of the sales price up front. The new terms of purchasing a home was that you put 10% or 20% down, and the bank financed 80% of it, not over 5 years, but over 30 years at relatively low rates. This opened up the opportunities for Americans to own homes like ever before. The average person could own that home.
If these terms sound familiar, they should, because this is essentially the same financing scheme that allows most Americans to own their homes today. Federal programs and banks sank millions into the home construction industry. Their message to veterans: you can afford a new home. Buy a new home now. On the outskirts of Baltimore, Memphis, Chicago, Los Angeles, Denver, and other cities, brand new communities sprang up. One of the most famous was a Long Island potato field, transformed into 17,000 new homes. It was called Levittown. Tax dollars helped make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
You have to remember, the people who came here in 1947, 1948 were young ex-GIs whose uppermost concern was taking advantage of the GI Bill and making things better for themselves.
Before moving to Levittown, Herb Callisman and his wife Doris lived in a cramped attic apartment in New York City.
And when we began to look for an apartment, we found that the apartments were $100, $125, $150 a month. I know that's unbelievable today, but it was too expensive for us. And out here in Levittown, the mortgage payments were $65 a month.
Your kitchen dazzles every eye. A brand new sink, a built-in oven, a new refrigerator, and a...
If you were buying a Levitt home in 1947, 48, 49, 50, and 51, you would get, this would be your kitchen. You would get a GE stove, GE refrigerator, and a Bendix wash machine. It would be part of the real estate.
Came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
It was as though it wasn't real. You can't imagine. But for someone to come out and actually tell you that they can't sell to you. You know, I was really on an up. Man, look at this house. Can you imagine having this? And then for them to tell me because of the color of my skin, I can't be a part of it.
The FHA underwriters warned that the presence of even one or two non-white families could undermine real estate values in the new suburbs. These government guidelines were widely adopted by private industry. Race had long played a role in local real estate practices. Starting in the 1930s, government officials institutionalized the national appraisal system, where race was as much a factor in real estate assessment as the condition of the property. Using this scheme, federal investigators evaluated 239 cities across the country for financial risk.
So that those communities that were all white, suburban, and far away from minority areas, they received the highest rating, and that was the color green. Those communities that were all minority or in the process of changing, they got the lowest rating, and the color red. They were redlined. As a consequence, most of the mortgages went to suburbanizing America, and it suburbanized it racially.
The racial logic adopts the principle that an integrated neighborhood is a bad risk, is a financial risk, that an integrated neighborhood is likely to be an unstable neighborhood, unstable socially, but therefore also unstable economically.
When the white residents of 8 Mile Road in Detroit were told they were too close to a black neighborhood to qualify for a positive FHA rating, they built this 6-foot wall between themselves and their black neighbors. Once the wall went up, mortgages on the white properties were approved. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government underwrote $120 billion in new housing. Less than 2% went to non-whites.
I can understand an individual, depending on his environment or his family or whatever, being racist, but for your country to sanction it, give him tools to do that, there's something definitely wrong there.
I think we had the golden chance after World War II, and we flubbed it, because here we had a GI Bill that was that was available to everybody, but in a way they didn't make it available to everybody, and that was a golden opportunity in this country, and we missed it. We really missed it.
You can always tell, can't you? A town with good real estate people is a more substantial community because more people own their own homes. That's right.
And now it's sort of hard to believe that the federal government nationalized and introduced redlining. In a funny way, it wasn't just giving something to whites, it was constructing whiteness. Whiteness meant, as in the past whites had meant being a citizen and being a Christian, it now meant living in the suburbs.
Only 50 years before, European ethnics were believed to be distinct races. Now, in these new segregated neighborhoods, they blended together as white Americans.
We did have different religious groups. We were mixed up there, but we were an all-white community, and I think it's an unrealistic world. I think there's something sterile about everyone being on the same economic level and everyone being the same color.
It certainly doesn't promote a feeling of a wider world, wider, not whiter, to live in a place where there are only people that look like you.
Cartoonist Bill Griffith remembers moving from Brooklyn to Levittown as a kid.
It's an untenable artificial world. You're creating a weird utopia in a way. A utopia of middle-class white people who were trying to deny that they were living in a multi-racial world. And how long can you keep that up? You can't keep that up forever. Whether there were going to be black people in Levittown was just, it would be almost the equivalent of saying, are there going to be Martians in Levittown?
Basically, the idea of whiteness is who's included, who's part of the family, and it has material consequences. Blacks were completely left out of the housing market. The housing market that they were exposed to was largely public housing. And public housing, first of all, was built almost exclusively, with a few exceptions, in the central city. And after World War II, we started building this larger and larger public housing projects, which are called vertical ghettos. All of a sudden, you're concentrating large numbers of poor people of color in one place.
Another federal program, urban renewal, was supposed to make cities more livable. 90% of all housing destroyed by urban renewal was not replaced. 2/3 of those displaced were black or Latino.
Fair housing for all human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
In 1968, President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act. For the first time, racial language was removed from federal housing policy. Non-white families began moving into traditionally white communities in numbers.
We lived in an apartment, a two-family house in Queens, and when we came here, it was the first time we had bought a house, and I was looking for everything in the storybooks.
The Frisbees moved from Queens to suburban Roosevelt, only a few miles from Levittown. Like the Frisbees, many non-white families would discover the economic value of race in the real estate market. They watched as their homes and neighborhoods in suburbia declined precisely because they had moved into them.
When I moved into a neighborhood, I thought it would stay intact the way it was. On the street that I moved on when I moved there, it was predominantly white. Within 2 years, it was predominantly black.
It was called blockbusting. Real estate agents preyed on the racial fears of white homeowners to get them to sell their homes quickly for less than market value. The homes were resold to non-whites at inflated prices.
Well, they would say,
you know, we're having black people move in. Now, I will give you cash if you want to sell me your house. Do you want to stay with black people next door to you? And that's the way it went on. And as Bunny said, a lot of the people just said, yes, I'll take the money and run. And that's the start of the white people leaving.
As more black and Latino families moved to Roosevelt, real estate became more and more depressed, just as the FHA had predicted. But why?
I have an idea my house is probably worth around 120 in this town. But what it would be worth in Wantor or Garden City or some other place, probably around 200,000 or better. Now you're talking about 80,000. You said to me one time about why do people dislike the blacks? Well, money-wise, there's a reason. Not that you dislike the blacks so much, but you dislike what happens when a community turns from white to black.
It wasn't African Americans moving in that caused housing values to go down in Roosevelt and other neighborhoods. It was whites leaving.
When a neighborhood, a previously white neighborhood, starts to integrate, even if individual whites don't have personal or psychological animosity or racial hatred, they still have an economic incentive to leave because they recognize that others might make the same calculation and leave first. So you get a vicious circle where whites calculate that other whites are going to sell when a neighborhood integrates, therefore they want to sell first to avoid losses, and they actually make it happen. They make white flight happen.
And if you think about African Americans, if African Americans are 20% of that market, it means that 80% of the people are not looking in those places for homes. So the prices of those homes declines or stays stable. And banks contribute to this by continually making loans in regions that are on the rise, white communities, and making it difficult to get loans in black communities.
So there's a difference. There's a lack of symmetry that's important to keep in mind. So it's not the same when whites are all by themselves, because when they're all by themselves, they're taking all the resources with them. They're taking all the amenities with them. But when blacks are by themselves, they can't get loans. They don't have a decent tax base. There are no jobs, and then that becomes associated with black space.
In the end, what happened to Roosevelt happens in many neighborhoods when white families and businesses flee. The tax base eroded. Schools and services declined. The town was seen by county officials as a legitimate dumping ground for welfare families.
At one point, we had explicit laws that says whites are on top and blacks are on the bottom. Today we have many of the same practices without the explicit language. And those practices are largely inscribed in geography. And so geography does the work of Jim Crow laws. So many people are confused as why after 50 years of civil rights are our schools still segregated? Why are housing markets still segregated? Why are our jobs still segregated? And again, a lot of this is a function of how we've reinscribed the racial geographic space in the United States. That structure is still what we're living with today.
As homes in white communities appreciated in value, the net worth of these white families grew. For most non-white families who stayed in urban neighborhoods, the housing market open to them in the 50s and 60s was largely a rental market. You don't gain equity by paying rent.
Where one's family lives in America is not just a matter of taste and preference. you have the issue of housing and wealth. The majority of Americans hold most of their wealth in the form of home equity. So that's their nest egg. That's how they can finance the education of their offspring. That's how they can sort of save up for retirement. It's their savings bank, right? They're living in their savings bank.
My family, like a lot of families, was in Detroit struggling to buy a house. You had a dual housing market, one white, one black. A housing market with one with a lot of demand, another housing market with very little demand. My father lives in the house that I grew up in. The house today, 5-bedroom house, is worth about $20,000. That same house bought in the suburbs would be worth today about $320,000. So whites moving to the suburb were being subsidized in the accumulation of wealth, while blacks were being divested.
And these were public policy decisions in which, on one hand, people were given access to property, given title, and subsequently wealth, and on another hand, where people were not given access to property, did not generate wealth, and did not generate the kind of opportunity for the next generation.
So if you can get a government loan and with your GI Bill, your newly earned college degree, and buy a house in an all-white area that then appreciates in value, that then you can pass on to your children, then you're passing on wealth that has all been made more available to you as a consequence of racist policies and practices. To the child of that parent, it looks like my father worked hard, bought a house, passed his wealth on to me, made it possible for me to go to school, mortgage that house so I could have, you know, relatively debt-free college experience and finance my college education. How come your father didn't do that? You know, well, there's some good reasons why maybe your father had a harder time doing it if you're African American or Latino or Native American.
And the thing that's really slick about whiteness, if you will, is that most of the benefits can be obtained without ever doing anything personally. For whites, they're getting the spoils of the racist system, even if they're not personally racist.
To glimpse one of the far-reaching consequences of racial inequality, you need only consider one statistic: comparative net worth or wealth. If you add up everything you own and subtract all your debts, what's left is your net worth.
Today, the average black family has only 1/8 the net worth or assets of the average white family. That difference has seemingly grown since the 1960s, since the civil rights triumphs, and is not explained by other factors like education, earnings rates, savings rates. It is really the legacy of racial inequality from generations past. No other measure captures the legacy, the sort of cumulative disadvantage of race, or cumulative advantage of race for whites than net worth or wealth.
Even with the same income, white families have on average twice the wealth of black families. Much of that difference lies in the value of their homes. But what happens when we compare families along the color line who have similar wealth?
When you make the right comparison, when you compare a black kid from a family with the same income and wealth level as the white kid from the similar economic situation, rates of college graduation are the same. Rates of employment and work hours are the same. Rates of welfare usage are the same. So when we're talking about race in terms of a cultural accounting of these differences or a genetic accounting of these differences, we're really missing the picture because we're making the wrong comparison.
We want to be a colorblind society that values the content of character over the color of skin. The hope of thousands of newcomers who arrive each year is that we already are.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic of which...
I don't see color. I see people. the saying goes.
There are people from 100 other nations who look different from you. People whose religion, history, skin color, and reason for being here today may be different from yours.
But in post-civil rights America, is color blindness the same as equality?
The notion of color blindness came to us from that famous I Have a Dream speech of Dr. Martin Luther King, where he said that people should be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of the skin. And what has happened in the post-civil rights era is that whites have assumed that we are already there, that we're in a society where color does not matter.
On the one hand, the civil rights era officially ended inequality of opportunity, officially ended de jure legal inequality. At the same time, those civil rights triumphs did nothing to address the underlying economic and social inequalities that had already been in place. It doesn't recognize the fact that the rewards, the house, the Lexus, the big bank account, those are not only the rewards of the pot of gold at the end of the game, they're also the starting position for the next generation.
The wealth gap grows. The advantages of being white accumulate from one generation to the next.
What are the benefits or the advantages to being white in a society that has historically given benefits and advantages to members of the dominant group? And if you are a person who has that privilege, you don't necessarily notice it.
So until we recognize that there's really no way to talk about equality of opportunity without talking about equality of condition, then we're stuck with this paradoxical idea of a colorblind society in a society that's totally unequal by color.
Claiming we don't see race won't end racial inequality. As Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun said, to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way.
And just as we're born into the system, we don't ask to be loaded up with stereotypes or omissions or distortions when we come into the world. We don't ask to be in a structure which is unfair, but that's what we have inherited. Whether you identify as a person of color, whether you identify as a white person, it doesn't matter.
I think we have to be uncomfortable with the present racial arrangement. In a sense, I think we have to be willing to be uncomfortable, willing to demand more of ourselves and more of our country, and willing to make the invisible visible.
I think we all have to think about, what can I influence? I don't influence everything, but the things I do influence, I can think about, how am I making this a more equitable environment?
Would you like to go with me down my dead end street? Would you like to come with me to Village Ghetto Land? See the people lock their doors while robbers laugh and steal. Beggars watch and eat their meals from garbage cans. Gas is everywhere. It's a bloody scene. Killing plagues the citizens. Lost their own belief. Children play with rusted cars. Swords cover their hands. Politicians laugh and drink, drunk to all demands. Families buying dog food now. Starvation roams the street. Babies die before they're born, infected by the greed. Now some folks say that we should be glad for what we have. Tell me, would